A luxury motorcycle broke down on a dusty road. A barefoot 8-year-old boy offered his help. When the engine roared back to life, a businessman broke down in tears. Secrets of pain and loss came to light, and their lives changed forever in ways no one could have predicted. A story of overcoming, legacy, and the power of human connections. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. Sometimes the smallest hands are the ones that hold the greatest destinies. The October sun fell mercilessly on the dusty road, turning the cracked asphalt into a scorching griddle. The air vibrated with heat waves that distorted the horizon, creating mirages of water where there was only dry earth. In the middle of that desolate landscape, a luxury Italian motorcycle lay silent, its chrome engine gleaming under the relentless light like a jewel fallen from the sky. The man standing beside it didn't belong in this place. His white linen suit, though wrinkled from the heat, betrayed an urban elegance that contrasted violently with the rural surroundings. Drops of sweat ran down his forehead as he cursed under his breath, moving his cell phone in all directions in a desperate attempt to find a signal. Nothing. Only the heavy silence of the countryside, occasionally interrupted by the distant song of some bird. It was then that he saw him, a small figure emerging from the side road, walking with cautious steps. A boy, perhaps 8 years old, wearing clothes that had seen better days. His faded blue shirt was patched in several places with scraps of different fabrics, evidence of maternal care struggling against poverty. His shorts, 2 sizes too large, were held up with a worn rope serving as a belt. His bare feet, hardened by years of walking on hot earth, moved forward with a confidence that contradicted his apparent fragility. What most caught the businessman's attention was the toolbox the boy carried. It wasn't a modern plastic box with bright colors, but an ancient metal structure covered in rust, painted decades ago in a red that could now barely be distinguished under layers of oxidation and grime. The hinges squeaked slightly with each step, a metallic sound that mixed with the song of the cicadas. The boy stopped a few meters away, his dark eyes studying the motorcycle with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for his age. There was something in his gaze, a spark of knowledge that the millionaire couldn't immediately decipher. The boy's black hair, disheveled and covered in dust, fell over his forehead, but didn't hide the determination emanating from his thin face. "I can fix that," the boy finally said, his voice clear but shy, almost swallowed by the open space. The businessman's laughter erupted before he could contain it, a loud, almost cruel laugh that resonated in the still air. This boy? This little one covered in dust, with patched clothes and hands that seemed too fragile to even hold a decent tool, claimed he could repair a $50,000 machine. The idea was so absurd, it was almost offensive. "Kid," the man said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "This is a Ducati Panigale. It's not a bicycle. It's state-of-the-art Italian technology." But the boy didn't move. He didn't lower his gaze or retreat at the condescending tone. Instead, he took a step forward and pointed with a grease-stained finger toward the engine. "The intake valve is stuck," he stated, with a conviction that made the millionaire frown. "The fine dust from this region mixes with the extreme heat. It enters through poorly sealed joints and solidifies like cement. I've seen this problem before." The businessman blinked, surprised. The specificity of the observation disarmed him. For a long moment, he looked at the boy, then at the motorcycle, and back at the boy. Sweat continued running down his back. The sun gave no respite, and the reality was undeniable. He was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no other apparent option. "All right," he finally yielded, more from desperation than faith. "But if you break something—" "I won't break anything," the boy interrupted softly, already kneeling beside the engine with a familiarity that contradicted his vulnerable appearance. What happened in the next 20 minutes defied all the millionaire's expectations. The boy worked with a precision that bordered on artistic. His small hands, far from being an impediment, navigated the tight spaces of the engine with an ease that an adult mechanic would envy. Each movement was deliberate, the product of years of observation rather than formal training. First, he removed the air filter cover with an improvised tool, revealing the intake duct. The millionaire watched fascinated as the boy examined each component, his fingers feeling surfaces, identifying anomalies by touch as much as by sight. Then, using a liquid he extracted from a recycled glass bottle in his toolbox, he began meticulously cleaning the problematic valve. "My grandfather taught me," the boy murmured as he worked more to himself than to the stranger. "He said that engines speak if you know how to listen. This one has been asking for help since it arrived in town." The businessman felt something strange in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in months. It was respect, mixed with inexplicable sadness. This boy, in the midst of absolute poverty, possessed a gift that most people would never develop in their entire lives. Finally, after adjusting and cleaning, the boy stood up and looked at the millionaire. "Try starting it now." With trembling hands, more from anticipation than anything else, the businessman turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life with a perfect sound that resonated like music in the middle of the rural silence. The Ducati purred smoothly, each cylinder functioning in perfect synchrony. The millionaire was speechless. He watched the boy who was cleaning his tools with a dirty rag, his expression neutral, as if what he had just accomplished were the most normal thing in the world. In that moment, under the relentless October sun, two worlds touched. And though neither of them knew it then, that encounter would change the course of both lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The boy's home was 1.5 kilometers from the road, hidden behind a dirt path that snaked between abandoned crop fields. The house, if it could be called that, was a modest structure of adobe and salvaged wood, its rusted sheet metal roof secured with large stones to resist strong winds. A small vegetable garden struggled to survive in the backyard, with wilted tomato plants and some chili peppers that stubbornly clung to life. Miguel Angel Ramos Contreras had lived in that place his entire life. 8 years of existence contained in 2 small rooms he shared with his mother, his 2 younger siblings, and the ghostly memories of a father who had left when he was barely 3 years old. His grandfather's workshop, now closed and silent, occupied a separate building at the back of the property, a constant reminder of better times. That afternoon, after returning from the road with the coins the stranger in the suit had given him, Miguel found his mother hanging clothes on an improvised clothesline. Rosa Elena was 32 years old, but the wrinkles around her eyes and the permanent tiredness in her posture made her seem a decade older. Her hands, rough from washing other people's clothes for hours each day, worked mechanically, spreading shirts and pants under the descending sun. "Where did you get that?" she asked upon seeing the money, her voice charged with immediate suspicion. In her experience, easy money always came with a hidden price. Miguel explained the encounter, his words stumbling over each other in his rush to justify himself. He described the motorcycle, the well-dressed man, the mechanical problem he had identified and solved. Rosa listened in silence, her expression moving from concern to something more complex, a mixture of maternal pride and deep fear. "Don't go near that man again," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "Rich people don't give anything away. They always want something in return." But Miguel had already seen something different in the stranger's eyes, not greed or malice, but something he recognized because he felt it himself every day. A void. An absence so large it threatened to swallow everything else. What Miguel didn't know was that his mother had reasons to distrust that went beyond general prudence. Years ago, the boy's father had worked for a wealthy businessman, promising a generous salary for supervising a plantation. When there were problems with the harvest, the boss simply disappeared, leaving months of unpaid wages and a family plunged into debts they were only beginning to recover from. Rosa had sworn then that she would never again allow the promises of the rich to affect her family. Inside the house, Miguel's younger siblings, Daniela, 6 years old, and Roberto, 4, played with dolls made from knotted rags. Daniela, with large, curious eyes identical to her brother's, ran to Miguel when she saw him. "Did you fix something else?" she asked excitedly. At 6 years old, she had already learned to admire her brother's talent, seeing it as something magical and extraordinary. Miguel smiled and ruffled her hair, but his mind was elsewhere. As he put the coins in a rusty can hidden under his thin mattress, his thoughts kept returning to the Italian motorcycle. Not just to the mechanical challenge, which had been relatively simple once he identified the problem, but to the feeling of purpose he had experienced. For the first time in a long time, he had felt seen, valued for something more than his economic situation. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Miguel quietly went out to the yard. The full moon bathed the property with a silver light that turned the shadows into dancing figures. He walked to his grandfather's workshop, pushing the wooden door that protested with a sharp creak. The smell of oil and rusted metal hit him immediately, transporting him to happier memories. The workshop was just as his grandfather had left it 3 years ago, before illness took him away. Tools hung from the walls on improvised hooks, each one in its designated place. A workbench dominated the center of the space, its surface stained by decades of projects. In a corner, partially covered by a torn tarp, lay his grandfather's final project, an old motorcycle he had never finished restoring. Miguel sat on the cold cement floor and closed his eyes, letting memories flood him. His grandfather, Gerardo Contreras, had been the most respected mechanic in the region. People traveled from neighboring towns for him to diagnose problems others had declared unsolvable. But more important than his technical skill was his philosophy. A good mechanic doesn't just fix machines, mijito. He fixes the connection between people and the tools that make their lives possible. It's sacred work. Those words resonated in Miguel with a force that didn't diminish with time. Each time he repaired something, he felt he was honoring his grandfather's memory, keeping that sacred legacy alive. But he also felt the weight of a crushing responsibility. How could he dream of being a mechanic, of studying and learning more when his family barely survived? Wasn't it selfish to want something for himself when Daniela and Roberto needed food, clothes, opportunities he couldn't provide? This internal conflict tormented him constantly. At the village elementary school where he attended when he didn't have to help his mother, Miguel excelled in mathematics and science. The teacher, Mrs. Patricia, had commented on several occasions that the boy had extraordinary potential, but each compliment felt like a heavier burden, a reminder of doors that would remain closed no matter how much talent he had. "Why me?" he whispered to the still air of the workshop, his voice almost swallowed by the darkness. "Why do I have this gift if I can't do anything with it?" There was no answer, of course. Only the silence of the tools and the ghostly presence of a grandfather who was no longer there to guide him. Miguel remained seated in the darkness until fatigue overcame his turbulent thoughts, and then he returned to the house, slipping under the thin sheets next to his siblings. He couldn't know that at that precise moment, kilometers away in a modest hotel in the nearest town, the man in the white suit was also awake, staring at the ceiling of his room and thinking about the bright-eyed boy who had saved his day. Nor could he imagine that that chance encounter on a dusty road had already set in motion a series of events that would transform both lives in ways neither could anticipate. 3 weeks passed in a blink. For Miguel, they were indistinguishable days of exhausting routine, getting up before dawn to help his mother prepare breakfast, walking kilometers to school, returning to assist with household chores, and, when there was a free moment, taking refuge in his grandfather's workshop to work on small projects that neighbors occasionally brought him. A broken alarm clock here, a blender that stopped working there. Simple things that allowed him to practice and occasionally earn a few coins that contributed to the family's sustenance. The money the stranger had given him had been spent quickly on basic needs: rice, beans, some medicine for Roberto's persistent cough. Rosa had accepted the money reluctantly, but necessity had overcome her pride. In Miguel's mind, the encounter on the road had already become a memory beginning to acquire the quality of a dream, something that had happened but would never repeat. That's why, when the shiny black truck appeared on a Saturday morning in front of his house, raising a cloud of reddish dust, Miguel initially thought it had taken a wrong turn. Vehicles like that didn't arrive in this neighborhood. But when the driver got out, Miguel immediately recognized the figure. It was him, the man in the suit, though now he wore more casual clothes, denim pants, and a short-sleeved shirt that made him seem less out of place. "Miguel?" the man called, looking around until his eyes found the boy, who had dropped the bucket of water he was filling at the community well. Rosa appeared in the doorway of the house, drying her hands on her worn apron. Her expression was one of poorly disguised alarm, her eyes moving quickly between the stranger and her son. "Good afternoon," the man said, approaching with measured steps, conscious that he was on delicate ground. "My name is Eduardo Castellanos. A few weeks ago your son saved my day by fixing my motorcycle. I haven't been able to stop thinking about that since." The formal introduction seemed to slightly disarm Rosa, though her defensive posture didn't change. Eduardo continued, speaking directly to her with careful respect. "Ma'am, your son has an extraordinary talent. In my 35 years of life, I've met many professional mechanics with decades of experience, and none identified a problem as quickly as Miguel did." "My son goes to school," Rosa responded dryly, her voice charged with maternal protection. "We're not looking for work for him." "No, no," Eduardo raised his hands in a pacifying gesture. "Please, don't misunderstand me. I'm not here to offer him work. I'm here to offer something different." It was then that Miguel noticed what Eduardo was carrying in the back seat of the truck, a large box of new tools, gleaming in contrast to everything around them, and a stack of books. Eduardo saw the direction of his gaze and smiled slightly. "I brought these things for you, Miguel. Professional tools I bought in the city, and these books." He lifted one to show the cover displaying an engine diagram, "are manuals on modern automotive mechanics. I thought they might interest you." Miguel's heart beat so hard, he was sure everyone could hear it. New tools, real books about mechanics. It was more than he had dared to imagine. But Rosa stepped forward, physically placing herself between Eduardo and her son. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Nothing is free in this world, especially when it comes from people like you." The question hit Eduardo harder than he expected. For a moment, his mask of composure cracked, and something raw and painful appeared on his face. "You're right, Mom," he admitted, his voice lower. "I do want something in return. I want companionship, conversation. I want to teach someone and learn from someone. My son." The word stuck in his throat, but he forced himself to continue. "My son died 8 months ago in a car accident. He was 12 years old. He was brilliant, curious, passionate about mechanics just like Miguel. And since he left, there's a void in my life that I don't know how to fill." The silence that followed was heavy and complex. Rosa blinked several times, processing this unexpected revelation. Miguel felt a wave of contradictory emotions: compassion for Eduardo's evident pain, guilt for being a reminder of what he had lost, and a flash of understanding that perhaps this connection could benefit both of them. "I'm not trying to replace my son," Eduardo continued, looking directly at Rosa. "No one could do that. But in Miguel I saw something that reminded me there's still beauty in this world, that talent and passion can flourish in the most unexpected places, and I thought maybe we could help each other." Rosa looked at her son, searching his eyes for some sign. Miguel nodded almost imperceptibly. She sighed deeply, a mixture of resignation and cautious hope. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her tone still cautious but no longer completely hostile. Eduardo brightened slightly. "I come here on weekends when my work allows. I teach Miguel about modern engines, automotive electronics, advanced diagnostics. In return, he teaches me what his grandfather transmitted to him, the traditional techniques that aren't found in books, and if he's willing, he helps me restore some vintage motorcycles I've started collecting. It's therapy for me, you understand? It keeps me focused, gives me purpose." "And the tools," Rosa pointed to the box in the truck. "No strings attached." "No strings attached," Eduardo confirmed. "They're a gift, with no conditions. If you decide you don't want me to come back, I'll leave and Miguel can keep everything." It was the sincerity in his voice, more than the words themselves, that finally convinced Rosa. She nodded slowly, though her expression still showed reservations. "1-month trial," she said firmly. "If I see this affects Miguel's studies, or if he feels uncomfortable in any way, it ends. Understood?" "Completely," Eduardo responded, extending his hand. After a moment of hesitation, Rosa shook it. Miguel watched everything from the side, feeling as if he were witnessing a moment that would change the course of his life. He was right, though he still couldn't imagine to what extent. That afternoon, as Eduardo unpacked the tools and books in his grandfather's workshop, explaining what each instrument was for, Miguel felt that a new chapter was beginning. It wasn't just about mechanics or learning. It was about human connections formed in improbable circumstances, about two people finding in each other something they desperately needed. One a mentor and purpose, the other someone who believed in his potential beyond the circumstances of his birth. News of Eduardo's arrival and his gifts spread through the neighborhood with the characteristic speed of small communities. By Monday morning, when Miguel arrived at school, he could already feel the stares and hear the whispers that fell silent when he passed. The rumors, as expected, had mutated and grown with each repetition. "I heard the rich man is going to adopt the Ramos boy," Mrs. Dominguez murmured at the grocery store. "No, no," contradicted Don Esteban, the town's veteran mechanic, with barely concealed disdain. "He's looking for cheap labor. That's how the rich get richer, exploiting the talent of desperate people." "I heard the mother is selling herself," another voice added in a conspiratorial tone. "You know how these single women are. They'll do anything for money." Each version was worse than the previous one, each rumor more venomous. In a community where independence and pride were fundamental values, where accepting outside help was seen as weakness, Miguel's situation made him an object of judgment and speculation. At school, the atmosphere was no better. Carlos Mendez, a 10-year-old boy who had intermittently bullied Miguel for years, intercepted him in the playground during recess. "Look, everyone," Carlos called in a voice loud enough to attract attention. "Here comes the rich people's new favorite. What does it feel like to sell yourself, little Miguel?" The other children formed a circle, some laughing, others simply watching with that cruel neutrality of youth that can be as painful as active mockery. Miguel felt his face heat up but kept his gaze low. He had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. But this time was different. This time it wasn't just about him. "I'm not selling myself," he responded in a firm but controlled voice. "I'm learning. There's a difference." "Yeah, je sais," Carlos moved closer, his hot breath on Miguel's face. "Your mother must be proud. Finally found someone to pay for you." It was the insult to his mother that broke Miguel's control. Before he could think about it, his hands pushed Carlos backward. The larger boy stumbled, more surprised than hurt. The crowd of observers exhaled collectively, anticipating a fight. But before it could escalate, Mrs. Patricia appeared, separating them with firm but gentle hands. "Enough," she commanded, her voice cutting through the excited murmur of spectators. "Carlos, to the principal's office. Miguel, stay here." After the other children dispersed reluctantly, Patricia knelt in front of Miguel, studying his face with perceptive eyes that had seen too many children struggling with burdens too heavy for their years. "Tell me what's really going on," she said softly. And Miguel did. The words came out in a torrent. The encounter with Eduardo, the tools, the books, the rumors, the constant pressure of feeling he was doing something wrong when he only wanted to learn. Patricia listened in silence, nodding occasionally. "Miguel," she finally said, "people are afraid of what they don't understand. When someone receives an opportunity others don't have, especially in a community like ours where everyone struggles equally, it can generate resentment. It's not fair, but it's human." "But I didn't do anything wrong," Miguel protested. His eyes shining with tears he refused to shed. "I know, and your mother knows it too. But you're going to have to be stronger than the rest. You're going to have to prove with actions, not words, that this opportunity is worthwhile, that you'll take advantage of it in ways that benefit not just you but the entire community eventually." The teacher's words resonated in Miguel throughout the rest of the day. That night, he told Eduardo everything during their learning session. The businessman listened with a somber expression. "I expected this," Eduardo admitted. "When the world is divided between the haves and have-nots, any bridge between those worlds is viewed with suspicion. But, Miguel, I want you to know something. What we're doing here isn't charity. It's fair exchange. You have knowledge I don't have. I have access to resources you need. We're collaborating. There's nothing to be ashamed of." But the social pressure didn't diminish. During the following weeks, Rosa began to notice cold looks at the market. Some of the women who used to hire her to wash clothes found excuses not to anymore. The Ramos family was being subtly punished for daring to accept help, for breaking the unwritten rules of the community. The situation reached a critical point during a community meeting, a monthly gathering where residents discussed neighborhood matters. Don Esteban, the veteran mechanic, took advantage of the platform to express his concerns. "I'm not saying anything against the Ramos family specifically," he began, though his tone made clear otherwise. "But we need to talk about how the entry of wealthy outsiders into our community can change our way of life. They start with gifts, but what's next? Buying properties, displacing us, turning our home into a place where only those with money can survive." There were murmurs of agreement among some present. Others remained silent, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but not daring to contradict a respected elder. Rosa, seated in the back with Miguel at her side, felt her face burning. But before she could respond, an unexpected voice rose. "With all respect, Don Esteban," said Mrs. Patricia, standing up, "I think you're oversimplifying a complex situation." All eyes turned to the teacher. "Miguel Ramos is one of the most talented students I've had in 20 years of teaching. He has a gift that, without proper education, would be wasted. If a stranger is willing to invest in that potential, shouldn't we celebrate it instead of punishing it? Doesn't it say more about us than about them that we respond with suspicion instead of support?" The silence that followed was tense. Don Esteban frowned, clearly not expecting public opposition. "Furthermore," Patricia continued, her voice gaining strength, "I've met Mr. Castellanos. I've spoken with him about his intentions. He's not here to exploit anyone. He's here because he lost his son and found in Miguel a renewed purpose. Are we going to deny him that? Are we going to deny Miguel the opportunity to develop his skills simply because it makes us uncomfortable?" The teacher's argument didn't convince everyone, but it planted enough doubts to silence the most open criticisms. The meeting continued with other topics, but the damage was done. The division in the community was now explicit. That night back home, Rosa hugged Miguel tightly. "This is going to be harder than I thought," she admitted, her voice laden with exhaustion. "But if you believe it's worth it..." "It's worth it, Mom," Miguel interrupted with a conviction that surprised them both. "I'm going to prove to them they were wrong. I'm going to use what I learned to help everyone, not just myself." It was a bold promise from an 8-year-old boy. But in that moment, under the dim light of a flickering bulb, mother and son sealed a silent pact. They wouldn't let others' judgment dictate their future. December arrived with a change in weather. Cold mornings required sweaters, and nights became cold enough for breath to become visible. The monotonous summer landscape was subtly transformed. The fields acquired greener tones after the late November rains, and the air carried the aroma of wood burning in improvised fireplaces. For Miguel, these 2 months of work with Eduardo had been revelatory. Weekends had become his refuge, hours where he could completely immerse himself in the world of mechanics, without the constant weight of external judgment. Eduardo was a patient but demanding teacher, never making explanations easy, but also never allowing Miguel to give up when something seemed too complicated. "Automotive electricity is like a language," Eduardo explained while Miguel studied circuit diagrams. "At first it seems incomprehensible, pure scribbles, but once you understand the basic grammar, the symbols and connections, everything begins to make sense." Miguel absorbed each lesson with an intensity that reminded Eduardo painfully of his lost son. But there were also significant differences. While his son had had unlimited access to resources, Miguel learned with a hunger that came from knowing this opportunity might be the only one he'd have. Each book was a treasure, each new tool treated with almost religious reverence. During these sessions, Eduardo also learned. Miguel taught him the techniques his grandfather had perfected over decades: how to listen to the subtleties of a failing engine, how to identify problems by touch, how to improvise solutions when the right parts weren't available. It was knowledge that didn't come from manuals, but from generationally transmitted experience. "Your grandfather was an intuitive genius," Eduardo commented one afternoon while watching Miguel diagnose a transmission problem, using methods he had never seen in his years of experience with professional mechanics. "It's a shame he never received formal recognition for his work." The mention of his grandfather always brought a shadow of sadness to Miguel's eyes, but also pride. He said recognition didn't matter. What mattered was the work itself, helping people move forward with their lives. It was during one of these conversations that Eduardo proposed something that would change everything. "Miguel, I've been thinking," he began while they cleaned tools at the end of a particularly productive session. "I'd like us to work together on a special project. I have a 1962 Harley-Davidson motorcycle that needs complete restoration. It's a beautiful but complex machine. It'll take months, maybe more than a year, but if we do it together, you'll learn more than in any formal mechanics course." Miguel felt a rush of excitement mixed with terror. A classic Harley was a piece of automotive history, and the responsibility of working on something so valuable was overwhelming. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," he admitted, biting his lower lip. "Nobody is completely ready for projects that truly challenge them," Eduardo responded with a smile. "But that's exactly why we should do it. Real growth comes from being slightly outside our comfort zone." During the following days, Eduardo brought the motorcycle on a special trailer. When the protective tarp was removed, Miguel held his breath. Despite the deteriorated state, the beauty of the design was undeniable. The fuel tank showed traces of dark green paint under layers of rust. The chrome, though dull, still promised potential shine. It was like finding a jewel buried in mud. "The first thing," Eduardo explained, "is to document everything. We take photographs of each component before disassembling it. We create an organization system for the parts. Restoration isn't just repair, it's mechanical archaeology." The metaphor resonated with Miguel. During the following weeks, he became an archaeologist, carefully unearthing each secret the machine held. They discovered modifications that previous owners had made, some clever, others disastrous. Each finding was a lesson, but beyond the mechanics, something else was happening. Eduardo began sharing stories about his son, fragments of memory he had kept locked away since the accident. He talked about how Javier had insisted on disassembling his first bicycle at 6 years old, how he had spent hours imagining designs for vehicles of the future, how his boundless curiosity had sometimes been exasperating but always admirable. "He died too young," Eduardo said one afternoon, his voice barely a whisper. "A drunk driver crossed the lane. Instantaneous, no pain," the doctors said. But the pain remained for those of us left behind. Miguel didn't know what to say. At 8 years old, death still seemed abstract, distant. But he understood loss. His grandfather had been his connection to something greater, and when he left, a part of Miguel had gone with him too. "I miss my grandfather too," he finally offered. "Sometimes I come to the workshop just to be near his things." As if I could still feel his presence. Eduardo nodded, and in that moment of shared vulnerability, something fundamental changed in their relationship. It was no longer just teacher and student, not even mentor and protégé. They were becoming allies in pain, two people who had lost something irreplaceable and were trying to rebuild meaning in the work of their hands. The restoration project became their shared sanctuary. The town's rumors continued, but within the workshop walls a different space existed. A place where Miguel could be more than the poor boy, where Eduardo could be more than the rich intruder. They were simply two people trying to make something beautiful from something broken. January brought news that shook the fragile stability Miguel and Eduardo had built. The company Eduardo worked for, a multinational import and distribution corporation, was restructuring its regional operations. As part of this change, they offered him a managerial position in the capital, more than 300 kilometers away. It was a significant promotion, recognition of his years of service, but accepting would mean abandoning the restoration project, and more importantly, his mentorship with Miguel. Eduardo shared the news on a Saturday morning, his words measured but loaded with internal conflict. "I haven't given an answer yet," he explained, as he and Miguel worked on the Harley. "The deadline is 2 weeks, and before deciding, I wanted to talk to you about this." Miguel felt his stomach contract. During the last 3 months, these weekend sessions had become the axis of his life. Without them, he would return to the monotonous routine of survival that had defined his previous years. The new tools would lose their purpose, without someone to guide him in their use. The books would remain partially read, full of concepts he needed someone to explain. "What are you going to do?" he asked, keeping his eyes fixed on the carburetor he was cleaning, unable to look directly at Eduardo. "I don't know," Eduardo responded honestly. "From a professional standpoint, it would be foolish to refuse it. The salary would almost double. I'd have real influence over important decisions. It's the kind of opportunity people wait their entire careers for." "But," Miguel left the word floating, hoping Eduardo would complete the thought. But, Eduardo continued with a deep sigh, I also feel I'd be abandoning something important here. Not just our project, Miguel, but a responsibility I've assumed. A commitment I made, not explicitly, but that's real nonetheless. It was Miguel's older sister, Lucia, who further complicated the situation. Lucia was 16 years old, an age where decisions made could permanently alter the course of a life. She had dropped out of secondary school 2 years earlier to work full-time at a textile factory, contributing significantly to the family income. She was a silent but essential presence in the house, someone who had sacrificed her own ambitions for the collective good. Seeing her younger brother receive opportunities she had never had generated in Lucia, a complex mixture of emotions. Pride, certainly. No one could deny Miguel had a special talent, but also resentment, a feeling that filled her with guilt, but that she couldn't completely ignore. Why him and not her? Was her sacrifice now less valuable? These tensions exploded one night during dinner, when Rosa casually mentioned that Eduardo had offered to buy new school uniforms for Miguel. Of course, Lucia muttered, pushing rice around her plate without eating. More gifts for the favorite. Rosa looked at her surprised. Lucia generally kept her thoughts to herself. Lucia, it's not like that, Rosa began. Isn't it? Lucia interrupted, her voice rising. Miguel receives tools, books, attention, opportunities. And me, what do I get? 10 hours a day sewing buttons for a miserable wage. But it's okay because Miguel is the special one, right? The one with the gift. Miguel felt his face burning. The guilt he always carried with him, that constant weight of having something others didn't have, intensified painfully. I didn't ask for any of this, he said quietly. I know, Lucia responded, her anger deflating as quickly as it had appeared. I know, little brother, and that's the part that makes this all worse. It's not your fault, but I also can't help feeling that life is unfair. The silence that followed was dense with unexpressed emotions. It was Daniela, the 6-year-old sister who generally remained outside family conflicts, who broke it with the brutal clarity of childhood innocence. But if Miguel learns a lot, can't he help all of us later? She asked, looking between her older siblings. Isn't that good? The little girl's simple logic disarmed the tension. Lucia let out a laugh without humor and reached across the table to ruffle Daniela's hair. You're right, little one. You're completely right. This confrontation precipitated a deeper conversation in the Ramos family that night, after the younger children fell asleep. Rosa, Miguel, and Lucia sat at the kitchen table, a solitary candle providing enough light to see each other's faces, but leaving long shadows in the corners. Lucia, Rosa began carefully, I know we haven't talked enough about your own dreams. You've sacrificed so much. No, Mom, Lucia shook her head. I don't want your pity. I made my decision knowing the consequences. What I need is for you to understand that sometimes it's hard, seeing Miguel receive all this while I work in a factory that treats me like just another machine. What did you want to do? Miguel asked, genuinely curious. In all these years, he had never thought to ask her about her aspirations. Lucia laughed softly. It seems silly now, but I wanted to study nursing. I liked the idea of helping people, of making a difference in moments of crisis. But that requires years of study, money we don't have. It was Eduardo who, when Miguel told him about this conversation, proposed a solution no one had considered. Why not expand the scope of what we're doing? He suggested. Not just focus on you, Miguel, but create opportunities for more people. Your sister, other young people from the neighborhood. If I'm going to invest in this community, why limit myself to one person? The idea was bold and complicated. It would mean a much greater commitment, not just of time, but of resources. But it also offered an answer to the constant criticism that Eduardo was showing favoritism. If he helped several people, if he created a structured program, perhaps he could change the narrative from charity to community investment. But your job, Miguel reminded him, the transfer to the capital. Eduardo remained silent for a long moment, his hands motionless over the tool he held. Finally he spoke, but his voice was different, loaded with a decision that had clearly been gestating. I've been thinking about that. My career has been my life for 15 years, but in these last months, working with you, connecting with this community, I've felt more alive than in years. The extra money from the promotion, what would it really give me? A bigger house that would still feel empty. More prestige in an industry that's never made me truly happy. Are you saying that? I'm saying I'm going to reject the transfer. In fact, I'm going to request a reduction to part-time. That will give me space to do something more meaningful here. The decision wasn't easy or immediate. Eduardo spent days deliberating, making calls to contacts in other cities, researching funding options for educational programs. But gradually, a vision began to take shape. A technical training center that would offer free courses in mechanics, electronics, carpentry, and other trades. Not a favor, but a formal program with structure and measurable goals. When he finally shared this plan with Rosa, her reaction was one of astonishment, mixed with healthy skepticism. That sounds beautiful, Mr. Castellanos, but it also sounds extremely expensive and complicated. It is, Eduardo admitted, but I have some savings, and more importantly, I have contacts at foundations that fund community development projects. If I can demonstrate there's real need and local capacity, we can obtain significant grants. Lucia was offered to be part of the pilot program, along with 5 other young people from the neighborhood who had expressed interest in learning trades. For her, it meant the possibility of studying first aid and basic health care while continuing to work part-time. It wasn't formal nursing, but it was a step toward where she wanted to be. The night Lucia accepted, she hugged Miguel with an intensity that surprised him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry I was resentful. You didn't cause my problems, and now you're trying to help solve them." "You don't have to thank me for anything," Miguel responded, his voice muffled against his sister's shoulder. "We're family, that's what we do." March brought a discovery that would change everything. Eduardo had begun formal procedures to establish the training center, a bureaucratic process that required property inspections, construction permits, and environmental assessments. During one of these routine inspections, a local government official reviewed the neighborhood's property records and revealed something the Ramos family didn't know. Miguel's grandfather's workshop, which they had assumed was private family property, actually belonged to the municipality. Apparently, Grandfather Gerardo had never completed the land titling process, a common situation in communities where transactions were based more on verbal agreements and mutual trust than legal documentation. For decades, this hadn't been a problem because no one disputed the use of the space, but now, with renewed interest in properties in the area due to Eduardo's project, the government had decided to regularize all properties without clear title. The news arrived in the form of an official notice. The workshop would be included in a public auction in 2 months. Any person or entity could participate, and the property would go to the highest bidder. For Miguel, this revelation was devastating. The workshop wasn't just a physical space, it was the only place where he felt his grandfather's continuing presence. Each tool hung on the wall, each oil stain on the cement floor. Each smell was a tangible reminder of the man who had taught him to see beauty in the mechanical. Losing it would be like losing his grandfather a second time. Rosa, practical to the bone, immediately began making calculations. With her laundry income and the little the children contributed, there was simply no way to gather enough money to compete in an auction. Even the minimum base price, set at a fraction of the real market value for similar properties, was beyond their reach. "I could lend you the money," Eduardo offered when Miguel told him about the situation. "No interest, flexible payments, you don't have to think of it as debt, but as—" "No," Miguel interrupted with more force than he intended. "I can't. We can't keep accepting your money, you've already done too much." It was the first time Miguel had explicitly rejected Eduardo's help, and the businessman immediately recognized the source of this resistance. Pride mixed with fear of perpetual dependence. If they accepted more and more, when would it end? At what point would gratitude become permanent obligation? "I understand," Eduardo said softly, "and I respect your position. But think about this. If we don't buy that workshop, what will happen to it? Probably some developer will demolish it to build something completely different, All your grandfather's legacy lost. The pressure was immense. Miguel spent sleepless nights, tossing in the thin bed while his siblings slept beside him, his mind running in circles without finding a solution. The workshop represented not just memory, but potential. With that space and proper equipment, he could truly start a small business, justify all the learning Eduardo had facilitated. Without it, he would remain dependent on others' goodwill. It was Rosa who finally revealed the secret she had jealously guarded for years. One morning before dawn, she woke Miguel and indicated he should follow her outside the house. They walked to the back of the yard, where a large rock marked the boundary of their property. Rosa began digging next to the rock with a rusty shovel, her movements urgent but cautious. 1/2 meter down, the shovel hit metal. Rosa lifted a large glass jar, sealed with wax. Inside, in the growing light of dawn, Miguel could see carefully folded bills and coins. "This," Rosa said, cleaning dirt from the jar, "is every cent I've been able to save in the last 8 years, since your father abandoned us. My grandmother taught me this tradition. Keep money where no one can find it, not even yourself in moments of weakness. It's for true emergencies." Miguel watched astonished as his mother counted the money. It wasn't a fortune, it didn't even come close to the total amount they would need, but it was significant. Years of centavos and pesos saved in secret, depriving herself of small luxuries to accumulate this reserve. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Miguel asked. His voice choked. "Because if I had, I would have been tempted to spend it 1,000 times. Every time Roberto needed medicine, every time you needed new shoes. But I knew that someday there would be a bigger reason, an opportunity we couldn't miss." The emotion Miguel felt was complex: gratitude for his mother's sacrifice, guilt for representing so many of those moments when the hidden money would have relieved immediate pressures, and determination to make every cent worthwhile. With Rosa's savings and a small contribution from Eduardo, carefully presented as advance salary for future work on the training center project, the Ramos family was able to gather the minimum amount to participate in the auction. The day of the auction arrived with palpable tension. The bidding took place at the municipal town hall, a deteriorated colonial building that had seen better days. Miguel, Rosa, Lucia, and Eduardo arrived early, occupying seats in the back rows of the main hall. Other participants gradually arrived, some small investors looking for cheap properties, some families from the neighborhood interested in other lots, and worryingly, a local businessman known for buying old properties, demolishing them, and building modern concrete structures. When it came time for Gerardo Contreras' workshop, identified bureaucratically only by its plot number and dimensions, the government's official auctioneer began bidding with the minimum price. Rosa's hand rose immediately, her face pale but determined. The local businessman, a robust man named Humberto Salas, immediately recognized Rosa. An ironic smile crossed his face. He raised his hand, increasing the bid by 10%. Miguel felt his heart sink. Humberto had much greater resources. This could become a bidding war they couldn't win. Rosa, however, didn't hesitate. She increased her bid by the minimum allowed. The room had fallen silent, all eyes moving between Rosa and Humberto like spectators at a tennis match. Humberto, clearly enjoying the situation, increased his bid again, this time by 20% over the previous one. Eduardo leaned toward Miguel and whispered, "Let me intervene, I can." "No," Miguel interrupted firmly. "We do this ourselves or we don't do it." Rosa increased her bid once more, and Miguel could see her hands trembling slightly. They were reaching the limit of what they had gathered. One more bid from Humberto, and they would be out. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patricia, the teacher who had been sitting in the front observing silently, stood up. 50% over Mrs. Ramos's last bid, she announced clearly. The room exploded in murmurs. Humberto turned, surprised and annoyed. Rosa looked at Patricia with wide eyes, not understanding. Patricia continued, her voice firm, "But with one condition. I'm bidding as part of a community cooperative. The property, if we win it, will be titled under a trust that guarantees its use for technical training and community development. It cannot be resold or demolished without community approval." It was a brilliant legal maneuver. Patricia had researched community property laws and found a clause that allowed bids with specific conditions if they served public interest. By establishing these restrictions, she made the property less attractive to speculators like Humberto, who clearly wanted complete freedom to do whatever he desired with the land. Humberto frowned, calculating quickly. A property with so many restrictions wasn't worth the effort. With visible disgust, he leaned back in his seat and crossed his arms. "Any other bids?" the official auctioneer asked, looking around the hall. Silence was his answer. "Then, lot number 37 goes to the cooperative represented by Patricia Morales for—" The rest of the words were lost in the roar of emotion that burst in Miguel. Rosa was crying openly, hugging Patricia, who had come down from her seat to join them. Lucia, for her part, held Miguel's hand tightly, her own face wet with tears of relief. After the legal procedures and necessary signatures, everyone gathered outside the town hall. Patricia explained she had been planning this since she heard about the auction, secretly contacting other community members and organizing the cooperative. Several neighbors had contributed small amounts, enough to make a competitive bid. "This was never just about your family, Miguel," Patricia explained. "It's about what your grandfather represented. Shared knowledge, community, helping each other. If we can preserve that legacy and expand it, everyone benefits." Eduardo, who had remained relatively quiet throughout the process, finally spoke. "This," he said, his voice loaded with genuine emotion, "this is what it should have been from the beginning. Not an outsider rescuing the locals, but a community recognizing its own value and fighting to preserve it." That night, the Ramos family dined with a joy they hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed to contain possibilities instead of just more of the same. Grandfather's workshop was secured not just for them, but for the entire community. And in that small triumph lay the promise of something much greater. The workshop cleanup began on a bright Saturday in April. The community cooperative had organized a volunteer work day, and nearly 20 people showed up with brooms, rags, and buckets. The space, closed for 3 years, had accumulated layers of dust that turned every surface into a topographic map of abandonment. Miguel worked methodically, cleaning each tool before returning it to its designated place on the wall. Every object brought memories. This wrench had adjusted 1,000 impossible nuts. That hammer had straightened countless pieces of metal. They were family relics with as much sentimental as practical value. It was Lucia who found the first notebook. She was cleaning a high shelf, shaking off years of cobwebs, when a pile of notebooks tied with cord fell to the floor with a soft thud. The cardboard covers were stained and discolored, but when she opened the first one, the pages revealed Grandfather Gerardo's careful, slanted handwriting. "Miguel," she called, her voice trembling with emotion, "you need to see this." The boy ran to her, and together they examined the discovery. It wasn't just one notebook, but dozens of them, technical journals where his grandfather had documented every significant repair he had made during decades. The entries were meticulously dated, beginning in 1973 and continuing until just weeks before his death in 2022. Eduardo, who was helping sweep the outer yard, entered upon hearing the commotion. When he saw the notebooks, his eyes lit up with the recognition of someone who understands the value of technical documentation. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, turning pages with reverence. "Your grandfather wasn't just an exceptional mechanic, Miguel. He was a self-taught engineer. Look at these diagrams, these notes about modifications. This is real research and development." During the following hours, while the rest of the group continued cleaning, Miguel, Lucia, and Eduardo immersed themselves in the notebooks. Each page revealed new layers of genius. Grandfather had developed innovative solutions to common mechanical problems, had designed custom tools for specific jobs, had even documented experiments with alternative fuels decades before they became mainstream trends. But the most astonishing thing appeared in one of the last notebooks, dated just 6 months before his death. Pages and pages of calculations, technical drawings, and notes about a project he had never mentioned to anyone. A completely new motorcycle engine design that promised to be more efficient, cleaner, and more powerful than conventional designs. "This is revolutionary," Eduardo said, studying the schematics with growing disbelief. If these calculations are correct, this engine could reduce fuel consumption by 30% while increasing power. Why did he never build a prototype? Miguel vaguely remembered conversations with his grandfather about a special project, but the old man had always been evasive, saying it wasn't ready yet. Now, looking at these pages filled with meticulous work, Miguel understood. His grandfather had been perfecting the design, wanting to make sure every aspect was correct before attempting physical construction. He didn't have the materials, Miguel murmured, his fingers tracing the diagrams. Some of these parts require precision that only industrial machines can achieve. He knew it. That's why he kept refining the design, waiting for the moment when he could access those resources. That night, after everyone had left, Miguel remained in the workshop with the notebooks scattered around him. Under the light of a solitary bulb, he read entry after entry, absorbing not just the technical knowledge but something deeper. His grandfather's philosophy about work, about persistence, about the importance of documenting even failures because every mistake taught something valuable. In a particularly moving entry dated 3 months before his death, his grandfather had written, "Today I worked with my grandson Miguel on repairing a water pump. He's only 5 years old, but already shows an intuitive understanding of how things work. I tell him that machines are no different from people. Both need care, attention, and sometimes just need someone to take the time to really understand them. If something happens to me before he grows old enough, I hope these notebooks teach him what I couldn't." Tears ran down Miguel's cheeks as he read these words. His grandfather had known time was running out, had felt illness approaching, and had tried to leave a tangible legacy. These notebooks weren't just technical records. They were love letters to a grandson, lessons preserved in ink for when he was old enough to fully appreciate them. During the following days, Miguel became obsessed with the engine design. Every free moment he spent studying the diagrams, making his own calculations to verify his grandfather's work. Eduardo, recognizing the importance of this project, began researching custom parts manufacturers, calculating costs, exploring possibilities. "If we could build even a functional prototype," Eduardo said during one of their sessions, "we could patent it. It wouldn't just be a tribute to your grandfather, Miguel. It could generate significant resources. The patent rights for an engine like this would be worth—" "I don't care about the money," Miguel interrupted firmly. "I want to build it because it was his dream, because he dedicated so much time and energy to this, and he deserves to see his work come to life, even if he can't be here to see it." The determination in the 9-year-old boy's voice deeply impressed Eduardo. Here was someone who understood that true legacy wasn't measured in financial terms, but in the realization of visions that transcended individual mortality. The revelation of the notebooks changed something fundamental in how Miguel saw himself. He was no longer just a poor boy, lucky to have found a generous mentor. He was the heir to a lineage of innovation, the bearer of knowledge that had been refined generation after generation. This understanding gave him a new confidence, a sense of purpose that went beyond the immediate circumstances of his life. But with this confidence also came new pressure. If his grandfather had been a misunderstood genius, what expectations now fell on Miguel? Did he have an obligation to reach those heights, to validate his grandfather's sacrifice, and work with equally impressive achievements of his own? These questions kept him awake many nights, staring at the ceiling while his siblings slept. The weight of legacy was sometimes overwhelming, but it was also electrifying. For the first time in his life, Miguel was beginning to believe he could be something more than a survivor. He could be a creator, an innovator, someone whose work would matter beyond the narrow borders of his neighborhood. May arrived with premature heat that turned afternoons into suffocating saunas. The technical training center was gradually taking shape. Approved permits, some equipment donations, a basic curriculum developed with help from Patricia and other local teachers. The official inauguration was scheduled for July, a date that now seemed as much promise as pressure. Eduardo had taken his restored Ducati to a classic motorcycle exhibition in the regional capital, a prestigious event that attracted collectors from across the country. The motorcycle, gleaming after months of careful work, had been the center of attention. Several collectors had expressed interest in buying it, offering sums that would have tempted any reasonable person. But Eduardo had rejected every offer. That machine represented something that couldn't be quantified monetarily. The first project he had shared with Miguel, the literal and metaphorical vehicle that had initiated their connection. The exhibition lasted 3 days. On the second night, while attendees slept in nearby hotels, someone forced entry into the exhibition building. Security cameras captured a hooded figure, efficient and professional movements. In 17 minutes, the thief had disabled alarms, broken the locks on the display case where the Ducati rested, and rolled it out to a waiting truck. By the time guards responded to the silent alarm, it was too late. Eduardo received the call at 4 in the morning. Miguel, who was spending the weekend with him in a modest hotel, a gift for his recent 9th birthday, woke to the sound of Eduardo's shattered voice speaking with the police. When the man hung up, his face was pale, hands trembling. "They took it," he whispered. "The Ducati. All that work. All those months." For Miguel, the impact was visceral. That motorcycle represented his introduction to Eduardo's world, the initial connection point that had changed the course of his life. More than that, they had worked on it together, had shared stories while cleaning parts, had celebrated each small triumph in the restoration. It was, in a sense, as much his as Eduardo's. "We're going to get it back," Miguel declared with a conviction that surprised them both. "I'll use every contact I have. Mechanics talk, they share information. Someone is going to try to sell parts or the complete bike, and when they do, we're going to know." Eduardo wanted to object, to say the police would handle the investigation, that it was too dangerous to involve a child in something like this. But he saw the iron determination in Miguel's eyes and recognized something. This wasn't just about recovering stolen property. It was about Miguel reclaiming agency, demonstrating he could be more than a passive recipient of help, that he could contribute significantly when it mattered. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Miguel contacted every mechanic, parts seller, and motorcycle enthusiast he knew directly or indirectly. He used the networks his grandfather had built during decades, introducing himself as Gerardo Contreras' grandson, invoking that name that still carried weight in technical circles. Lucia, applying organizational skills she had developed at the factory, helped create a system to track leads. They put a large map on the workshop wall, marking locations where there were reports of suspicious activity, connecting dots with red thread like detectives in the movies they occasionally watched on the community television. The search revealed an underground world Miguel had barely suspected existed. There was an entire clandestine economy of stolen automotive parts, a complex network of intermediaries who bought vehicles or components without asking questions, dismantled them, and sold the parts through channels that were difficult to trace. It was a sophisticated business, fed by constant demand for cheap spare parts in a country where imported vehicles were expensive, and original parts even more so. After 2 weeks of persistent investigation, a promising lead emerged. A parts seller in a town 100 kilometers away had mentioned a customer looking for very specific components from a Ducati, components that corresponded exactly to the stolen model. The seller, who had known Miguel's grandfather and respected his memory, discreetly shared this information. Eduardo and Miguel, accompanied by an off-duty police officer who had taken genuine interest in the case, traveled to the town. The address they had took them to a property on the outskirts, a body shop that seemed legitimate on the surface, but that, according to local rumors, also functioned as a meeting point for less legal activities. What they discovered there was unexpected. The Ducati was, in fact, at the shop, but in deplorable condition. The original thief, apparently frightened by the media attention the theft had generated, the story had been covered in local news due to the motorcycle's value, had panicked and abandoned it on a secondary road. There, a scrap collector had found it, not knowing its origin, and had sold it to this shop for a fraction of its real value. The shop owner, an older man named Arturo, showed documentation proving his legitimate purchase from the scrap collector. Technically, he hadn't done anything illegal. He had bought what he believed was an abandoned motorcycle through established channels. "I understand this machine is important to you," Arturo said after hearing the complete story, "and I sympathize. But I also invested money in its purchase. I can't just give it away. It was a complicated moral and legal impasse. Eduardo could have forced the issue through legal channels, proving original ownership, but that would take months of litigation. Arturo, for his part, would face significant financial losses if he simply handed over the motorcycle. Miguel, observing the tension between the adults, had a bold idea. He approached Arturo, studying the man's tired face and grease-stained hands. "Mr. Arturo," he began, his voice clear and respectful, "may I see your workshop?" Arturo, surprised by the request, nodded and guided him through the space. Miguel observed everything: the equipment, the motorcycles in various states of repair, the half-finished projects. And then he saw something that gave him hope. In a corner, covered with tarps, there was a vintage Norton motorcycle from the 1960s, clearly a personal restoration project that had been abandoned. "Is that Norton yours?" Miguel asked, pointing. "It was my father's," Arturo responded, his voice softening. "He always wanted to restore it, but never had time. When he died, I inherited both the shop and the unfinished project. I've tried to work on it for years, but honestly, I don't have the specialized knowledge it requires." Miguel looked at Eduardo, who immediately understood where his thinking was going. "What if we made an exchange?" Miguel proposed. "You give us back the Ducati and we completely restore your Norton. No charge. We teach you the entire process, so you learn techniques you can apply to future projects. And at the end, you'll have a beautiful machine that honors your father's memory." Arturo blinked, processing the offer. It was generous, almost too generous. A professional restoration of a Norton in that condition would easily cost more than what he had paid for the Ducati. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Because I understand what it means to have an unfinished legacy," Miguel responded simply. "My grandfather also left projects incomplete, and because I believe everyone deserves the opportunity to honor the people who taught us to value this work." The sincerity in the boy's words moved Arturo in ways no legal argument could have. He extended his hand, first to Miguel, then to Eduardo. "You have a deal," he said, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. The recovery of the Ducati and the agreement with Arturo became local legend. The story spread quickly. The boy who had negotiated with intelligence and compassion, transforming a potential conflict into mutual collaboration. For the community that had been watching with skepticism the relationship between Miguel and Eduardo, this was tangible evidence that the boy was using his opportunities to create value, not just for himself, but for others. But for Miguel, the most significant thing was the confidence the episode gave him. He had faced a complex adult problem and had found a solution that satisfied all parties. He hadn't needed Eduardo to rescue him. He had been the one who rescued the situation. That shift in dynamics, subtle but profound, marked his transition from protégé to true partner. July arrived with anticipation for the training center's inauguration, now officially called Gerardo Contreras Technical Center, in honor of Miguel's grandfather. The name had been Eduardo's suggestion, unanimously approved by the cooperative. It was a way to anchor the project in local history, to establish it not as an external imposition, but as an extension of an existing legacy. The day of the inauguration dawned bright and warm. They had decorated the renovated workshop with tricolor flags and garlands, made by hand by the elementary school children. Long tables were arranged in the yard, loaded with traditional food that neighborhood families had contributed: tamales, pozole, fresh waters, sweet bread. It was a genuine community celebration, not the cold corporate event Eduardo had initially feared. More than 200 people attended, filling the space and overflowing into the street. There were veteran mechanics like Don Esteban, who had softened his initial position after seeing Eduardo's genuine commitment. There were young students, including several of Miguel's classmates, who now looked at him with a mixture of admiration and healthy envy. And there were municipal officials, including the mayor, who saw in the project an opportunity for press photos, but also genuinely hope for local economic development. The speeches were brief but emotional. Patricia spoke about the importance of practical education. Eduardo thanked the community for welcoming him and teaching him that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in human connections. Rosa, nervous in front of so many people, simply shared how much this would have meant to her father-in-law, how much he would have valued seeing his grandson, not just preserving but expanding his legacy. But it was Miguel's speech that really captured the spirit of the moment. The 9-year-old boy stood in front of the improvised microphone, his heart beating so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. He had prepared notes, but when the moment came, he put them in his pocket and spoke from the heart. "My grandfather taught me that fixing things isn't just about making them work again," he began, his voice clear despite his nerves. "It's about understanding that everything people build carries a part of themselves. When we fix something, we're honoring the work of whoever made it originally. We're saying their effort is worth preserving." He paused, looking around at the sea of faces. "This center isn't about me or Mr. Eduardo. It's about all of us recognizing that we have valuable skills, knowledge that deserves to be shared and preserved. And it's about remembering that the best tools we have aren't wrenches or hammers, but our willingness to teach and learn from each other." The applause that followed was genuine and prolonged. Eduardo felt tears running down his face without being ashamed of them. Rosa hugged her other children, her heart swelling with pride and relief that her decision to trust the stranger in the white suit had turned out right. After the formal speeches, demonstrations began. Miguel, along with other students from the pilot program, showed projects they had been working on. Lucia presented an improved first aid kit she had designed specifically for common workshop accidents. A young man named Daniel exhibited creative welding that had transformed discarded metal into functional art. Maria, who had been invisible in the neighborhood for years, demonstrated upholstery techniques for repairing vehicle seats. But the climactic moment came when Miguel and Eduardo revealed what they had kept secret for weeks: the functional prototype of the engine designed by grandfather Gerardo. They had worked tirelessly, using the specifications from the notebooks, consulting with engineers by video conference that Eduardo had contacted, manufacturing custom parts when commercial ones wouldn't work. The process had been arduous, full of failures and frustrations. They had built 4 versions before achieving one that actually worked according to the original design's parameters. The engine, installed in a transparent test structure so everyone could see its internal components, was dramatically revealed when Eduardo removed the protective top. The crowd pressed forward, fascinated by the ingenious design that combined traditional principles with innovations that, according to experts Eduardo had confirmed with, could truly revolutionize small engine efficiency. When Miguel turned the ignition key, the engine came to life with a smooth, uniform purr that contrasted markedly with the typical roar of conventional engines. The digital meters Eduardo had installed showed real-time data: fuel consumption, temperature, power output. The numbers confirmed what the calculations had predicted. It was significantly more efficient than standard designs of similar capacity. Don Esteban, who had remained skeptical throughout the celebration, approached the engine with the critical eyes of a professional. He studied each visible component, listened to the sound, observed the readings. Finally, he straightened and looked at Miguel with something that could have been respect. "Your grandfather was always smarter than all of us," he said simply, "and you, boy, are proving worthy of him." It was, coming from Don Esteban, the highest imaginable compliment. The celebration continued until sunset. When the crowd finally began to disperse, Eduardo and Miguel sat together on the bench outside the workshop, watching the sun paint the sky with shades of orange and purple. "You know," Eduardo said thoughtfully, "when my son died, I believed the best part of my life had ended, that all that remained was to exist, go through the motions without real purpose." Miguel listened in silence, feeling this was an important moment. "But this," Eduardo continued, gesturing toward the workshop, toward the community, "this has given me something I didn't expect to find again. It's not a replacement for what I lost. Nothing could be. But it's something new, something meaningful. And you, Miguel, taught me something I had forgotten, that purpose isn't something we find. It's something we build piece by piece, day by day." "My grandfather said something similar," Miguel responded. "He said life is like mechanics. There will always be things that break. What matters is whether we choose to fix them or give up." They sat in shared silence as night descended, two people separated by generation and circumstance, but united by loss, purpose, and the shared belief that broken things deserve to be repaired. The following months passed at an accelerated pace of activity and growth. The technical center operated at full capacity, with 3 class sessions per week covering everything from basic mechanics to advanced welding. Miguel, now nearly 10 years old, divided his time between regular elementary school, helping his mother at home, and serving as assistant instructor at the center. It was an exhausting schedule, but he flourished under the structure and purpose it gave him. Eduardo, fulfilling his promise, had reduced his corporate work schedule to part-time. Weekends were dedicated completely to the center, and special projects like the continued restoration of vintage motorcycles. Arturo's Norton, finished in August with his enthusiastic help, had turned out so spectacular that he now had a waiting list of clients wanting similar services. What had begun as a goodwill gesture had become a legitimate business opportunity. But in September, everything changed again. The corporation Eduardo worked for made an offer that was impossible to ignore. They wanted him to return full-time, not to the capital, but to their international offices in Europe. He would be regional director, overseeing operations in 5 countries, with a salary that would triple what he currently earned. It was the type of position most people spent their entire lives trying to reach. The offer came with a time condition. They needed his answer in 2 weeks, and expected him to start in a month if he accepted. Eduardo didn't immediately share the news. He spent 3 days struggling with the decision in solitude, weighing options, calculating consequences. Finally, during a work session in the workshop on a Saturday afternoon, while he and Miguel adjusted the prototype engine they were now preparing for a formal patent application, Eduardo shared the dilemma. "It's Europe, Miguel. Barcelona, specifically. One of the most important automotive innovation centers in the world. Laboratories, resources, connections that could make this engine." He touched the prototype affectionately. "Go from interesting concept to real commercial product." Miguel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He understood what Eduardo wasn't saying. Accepting would mean leaving. It would mean the end of their weekend sessions, the end of the direct mentorship that had been the pillar of his growth for almost a full year. "You should accept it," Miguel said, the words coming out more brusquely than he intended. "It's an incredible opportunity." "But there are other considerations." Eduardo sat on the workbench, his expression conflicted. "The center is barely established. The programs need continuity, and you're still learning, developing. I don't know if it would be responsible to simply leave now." During the following days, news filtered through the community. The reaction was mixed and complex. Some saw Eduardo's possible departure as confirmation of their initial suspicions, that his commitment had been temporary, charity tourism before returning to his privileged world. Others understood it was a professional opportunity no one in his position would reasonably reject. Rosa, when Miguel told her, had a reaction that surprised the boy. "You have to tell him to accept," she said firmly. "What? But Mom, he's a man with his own life, Miguel," Rosa interrupted gently. "He's done wonderful things for you, for our family, for this neighborhood. But he can't put his life on pause indefinitely. And if he truly values you, he'll find ways to maintain the connection even from a distance." The wisdom in his mother's words was undeniable, but Miguel struggled to accept it. He had become dependent on Eduardo in ways he was only beginning to recognize. Not just for technical education, but for validation, for believing his future could be different from his past. Lucia, who had initially been critical of her brother's dependence on Eduardo, now offered a different perspective. "You know what's the worst part of all this?" she said one night, while helping their mother with dinner. "That you were right. Eduardo really cares. He's not running away because he got bored or because he got what he wanted. He's struggling with an impossible decision, and that makes everything more complicated." The complexity of the situation reached a critical point during an emergency meeting of the community cooperative. Patricia called the meeting to discuss the technical center's future if Eduardo left. The room was tense with concern. "We need a contingency plan," Patricia said firmly. "The center can't depend on one person, no matter how dedicated." If we've learned anything this year, it should be that the community must be able to sustain itself. Don Esteban, surprisingly, was one of the first to offer concrete help. I can teach 2 classes a week, he said. Traditional techniques, repair of older vehicles. I don't know about modern electronics like Mr. Castellanos, but I know basic mechanics that never goes out of style. Others offered as well. A retired electrician proposed teaching basic circuits. A welder who worked at the local factory offered to lead evening sessions for workers who couldn't attend during the day. In the course of 2 hours, the community had built the skeleton of a sustainable program that didn't depend completely on Eduardo. Miguel watched all this with mixed emotions. It was inspiring to see the community mobilize, but it was also painful to recognize that Eduardo was effectively replaceable. The realization wasn't cruel. It was simply honest. Life would continue, with or without the man who had catalyzed so much change. That night, Miguel went alone to the workshop. He sat in front of his grandfather's prototype engine, now gleaming and perfected. A testament to what 2 people separated by decades could achieve when knowledge was passed carefully and lovingly. He thought about his grandfather, who had worked in relative obscurity his entire life, never receiving recognition beyond his small community. He thought about Eduardo, who had the opportunity to take that legacy to a world audience. And he thought about himself, caught between gratitude for what they had given him and fear of what he would lose. When Eduardo arrived at the workshop an hour later, he found Miguel sitting in the darkness. "I thought I'd find you here," Eduardo said softly, turning on a light. "Have you made your decision?" Miguel asked without preliminaries. "Almost, but I need to talk to you first, because you're part of the decision. Miguel, even if you don't want that responsibility. I don't want to be the reason you reject something like this," Miguel said quickly. "I can't carry that." "You wouldn't be," Eduardo assured him, sitting next to the boy. "But your opinion matters. Not because I'm going to blindly obey it, but because you've been the most important person to me this past year. You've given me purpose when I thought all purpose was gone." Miguel felt tears burning in his eyes but refused to let them fall. "My grandfather used to say something," he began with a trembling voice. "He said a good mechanic knows when a machine needs to be repaired, but a great mechanic knows when to let it go. He knows when forcing something to keep working causes more damage than simply accepting its time has ended." "Are you saying I should leave?" Eduardo asked, his voice loaded with emotion. "I'm saying you taught me to fix broken things," Miguel responded, finally looking directly at Eduardo. "But you also taught me that some things need to be free to function as they were designed. And I think you were designed for more than this small town. You came here because you needed to heal, and I think you have healed, or at least have begun to. Now it's time to use that healing for something greater." The tears finally fell from both Miguel and Eduardo. They embraced in the workshop's silence, surrounded by the tools and projects they had shared, knowing something fundamental was ending, but also that something new was beginning. Preparations for Eduardo's departure occupied the following 3 weeks. They were days filled with legal documentation, transfer of responsibilities, and difficult but necessary conversations about the technical center's future. Eduardo structured the center as a non-profit organization with a board of directors composed of community members, including Patricia as president, Rosa as treasurer, and Don Esteban as technical director. He established an endowment fund that would guarantee operations for at least 3 years, enough time for the center to develop its own income sources through paid services and additional scholarships. But beyond the formal structures, Eduardo worked intensely to secure Miguel's specific educational future. He contacted technical universities, established a personal scholarship fund specifically for Miguel's education through university level, and created a network of professional mentors who could provide distance guidance. "I'm not trying to control your life from afar," Eduardo explained as they reviewed the documents. "These are simply tools, resources available if you decide to use them. The decision will always be yours." During this period, the relationship between Miguel and Eduardo evolved subtly. It was no longer exclusively teacher and student, not even mentor and protege. They were becoming colleagues, partners in a project that would transcend either of their physical presence. The grandfather's prototype engine became the symbol of this transition. Eduardo had connected with a patent attorney in Barcelona who specialized in automotive innovation. They had begun the patent application process, but Eduardo insisted it be registered jointly. Gerardo Contreras, designer; Miguel Ángel Ramos Contreras, builder; Eduardo Castellanos, technical facilitator. It was recognition that innovation was rarely the product of a single mind, but of collaboration across time and space. If this becomes commercially viable, Eduardo explained, the rights will generate income. 1/3 will go to a fund for your family, Miguel, another third to the technical center, the last third to research and development of similar technologies. I'm not seeking personal profit from this. I already have more money than I need. What I want is for your grandfather's legacy to benefit the community that formed him. Rosa cried when she heard these terms. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. The possibility of financial security, of not having to constantly worry about how to feed her children, how to pay for their educations, was something she had barely dared to imagine. But it was the final conversation between Eduardo and Miguel, 2 days before departure, that truly sealed their transformed relationship. They met in the workshop at dawn, when the world was still, and the day's possibilities had not yet been defined by reality. Eduardo brought coffee for himself and hot chocolate for Miguel, a morning ritual they had shared for months. I want you to understand something, Eduardo began, his words measured but loaded with emotion. When my son died, a part of me died with him. I believed I could never feel real joy again, that all that remained was a kind of hollow existence. But then a motorcycle broke down on a dusty road, and an improbable boy fixed it, and slowly, piece by piece, something in me was also repaired. Miguel listened, motionless, feeling the weight of these words. You're not replacing my son, Eduardo continued. No one could do that, and it wouldn't be fair to put that expectation on you. But you taught me it's possible to form meaningful connections after devastating loss. That love isn't a finite resource that runs out when we lose someone. It expands, transforms, finds new channels. You taught me something too, Miguel responded. You taught me that talent without opportunity is like a tool without hands to use it, and that sometimes the most important connections are the ones we never expect to form. Eduardo extended his hand, but Miguel gently rejected it and instead offered a hug. They stayed like that for a long moment, teacher and student, mentor and protege, two people who had entered each other's lives by accident but had become fundamental to each other. I promise we'll stay in touch, Eduardo said. Weekly video calls, visits when possible, and when you're older, if you want, there's a place for you in Barcelona. Universities, workshops, opportunities. And I promise I'll take care of the center, Miguel responded. That I'll keep alive what we built. Not perfectly because I'm still young and I'll make mistakes, but I'll try. For you, for my grandfather, for everyone who believed in this. The last 2 days passed in a blur of goodbyes. There was a farewell dinner at Rosa's house, where Lucia cooked her best dishes, and even the younger siblings understood something important was ending. There was a ceremony at the technical center, where Eduardo formally passed leadership to the board of directors, a moment loaded with as much hope as anxiety about the future. And finally, there was the actual moment of departure. Eduardo had rented a car for the trip to the capital, where he would take an international flight. The entire Ramos family, along with Patricia, Don Esteban, and several other key community members, gathered to say goodbye. Don't say goodbye, Eduardo instructed when the moment came. Say, see you soon, because I'll return. Maybe not as frequently as we'd like, but this community is part of me now. You can't just walk away from that. Miguel nodded, unable to speak around the knot in his throat. When the car finally disappeared on the horizon, raising a column of dust, he stood staring until even the dust had settled, marking the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. The months after Eduardo's departure were, predictably, difficult. Miguel felt like an apprentice suddenly left without a master, unsure if the skills he had developed were sufficient to sustain him. The technical center continued operating, but with a different energy. Less brilliant, perhaps, but also more rooted in the community's daily reality. The weekly video calls with Eduardo helped, but also underscored the distance. Barcelona was 6 hours ahead, a time difference that often meant Miguel spoke with Eduardo late at night, after long days of school and work. Eduardo shared stories about his new job, the innovations he was seeing, the connections he was making. Miguel shared about the classes he was helping teach, the small projects he was completing, the ordinary struggles of keeping the center running. But something interesting began to happen. Without Eduardo there as a constant safety net, Miguel found himself forced to develop independent confidence. When complex mechanical problems arose, he couldn't simply wait for guidance from Eduardo. He had to trust his own judgment, consult his grandfather's notebooks, experiment, and sometimes fail. The failures, though painful, proved to be invaluable educational experiences, an engine he misdiagnosed and had to repair twice. Welding that failed and had to be redone from scratch. Each mistake was humbling but also enlightening, teaching lessons no direct instruction could have provided. Don Esteban, surprisingly, became an important ally during this period. The old mechanic, initially resistant to modern methods, developed respect for the unique combination Miguel represented. The grandfather's traditional wisdom mixed with the modern technical education Eduardo had provided. "Your grandfather and I were competitors," Don Esteban confessed one afternoon while they worked together on a particularly difficult transmission. "We both wanted to be known as the best mechanic in the region. It was stupid in retrospect. We both had different skills. We could have learned a lot from each other if our egos hadn't been in the way." "It's never too late to learn," Miguel responded, using a phrase Eduardo had frequently repeated. "Wise for your age, boy." Terrifying, honestly. Miguel's relationship with his school peers also evolved. Carlos Mendez, the boy who had previously bullied him, approached one day with an unexpected proposal. "My father has a delivery truck that keeps failing," Carlos said uncomfortably, clearly struggling with having to ask for help. "All the mechanics say it needs a completely new engine, but we don't have money for that. Could you look at it?" It was an olive branch, an admission that Miguel had valuable skills beyond any school social hierarchy. Miguel accepted without hesitation. The truck turned out to have a complex problem that required 2 weeks of intermittent work. But Miguel finally diagnosed and repaired it for a fraction of what an engine replacement would have cost. When Carlos's father tried to pay, Miguel refused the full amount. "Take enough to cover parts," he said. "The labor is free. We're building a community here, not just a business." The story spread, and gradually, more people began bringing jobs to the technical center, not just as a learning place but as a real service provider. The income generated, though modest, helped sustain operations and demonstrated that Eduardo's model was viable long-term. But not everything was steady progress. In December, almost 15 months after the initial encounter on the road, the center faced a financial crisis. One of the main grants Eduardo had secured wasn't renewed due to changes in the funding foundation's priorities. The endowment fund would cover basic operating expenses, but there would be no money for planned expansion or for updating aging equipment. The board of directors met in emergency session. The atmosphere was tense, with some members suggesting perhaps they needed to accept that the center would operate on a smaller scale than originally envisioned. It was Miguel who proposed the solution they finally adopted. "We need to show tangible value," he argued, his voice firmer than ever. "Not just abstract education, but products and services people can see and touch. I propose we launch a product line made at the center, artisanal metal furniture, specialized automotive components, even art. We use the skills we're teaching to create things we can sell." The proposal was bold and would require significant work to implement, but the board approved it. During the following months, the center partially transformed into a production workshop. Students, under instructor supervision, began creating products that combined functionality with aesthetics. Custom-designed metal grills, elegant industrial shelves, lamps made from recycled automotive parts. Miguel, remembering the design principles he had seen in his grandfather's notebooks, became deeply involved in product development. He discovered he had an eye for aesthetics, in addition to his mechanical talent, an ability to imagine how functionality and beauty could coexist. The products began selling first locally, then through an online platform Lucia helped establish using skills she had learned in night computer courses. It wasn't massive income, but it was sustainable, and more importantly, it was generated by the community itself. Eduardo, observing all this from Barcelona, through video calls and written reports, felt a pride that was different from what he had experienced when directly involved. This wasn't his achievement, it was theirs. He had planted seeds, but the community had nurtured those seeds into something more robust and self-sufficient than he had initially imagined. October arrived again, marking exactly 2 years since an Italian luxury motorcycle had broken down on a dusty road and changed 2 lives forever. Miguel, now 10 years old, and looking older than his age thanks to the responsibility he had assumed, prepared for a moment he had been anticipating with mixed nerves and excitement. The Technical Center was organizing its first regional mechanical innovation symposium, an event where students, professionals and hobbyists would share projects and ideas. Most significantly, Eduardo had promised to return for the event, his first visit since his departure a year ago. The preceding weeks were a frenzy of preparation. Miguel worked day and night perfecting the presentation he would give about his grandfather's engine and how traditional principles could inform modern innovation. Lucia, who now formally studied to be a health technician thanks to a scholarship the center had helped secure, organized the event's logistics. Rosa, with visible pride, had sewn a special shirt for Miguel, his first professional uniform. The day of the symposium dawned clear and bright, as if the universe conspired to make everything perfect. More than 100 people arrived from surrounding towns, a mix of curious professionals, students seeking inspiration, and community members supporting the project. But the moment Miguel most anticipated arrived, when a taxi stopped in front of the center, and Eduardo emerged, looking more tanned and perhaps more relaxed than when he had left, but essentially the same man who had extended his hand to a barefoot boy on a road 2 years ago. The hug they shared was deep and prolonged, words unnecessary when pure emotion was sufficient communication. "So you've grown," Eduardo observed, holding Miguel at arm's length to study him. "Not just physically. There's something different in your eyes. Confidence." "I learned from the best," Miguel responded with a smile. The tour of the center Miguel gave Eduardo was revealing. There were changes everywhere. New equipment acquired through donations and sales, recently painted walls with murals students had created, a display area where center products were shown with pride. But more than the physical changes, it was the energy. The place buzzed with activity and purpose. "This exceeded what I imagined," Eduardo admitted, his voice loaded with genuine emotion. "I planted the seed, but you cultivated an entire forest." Miguel's presentation during the symposium was the day's highlight. Standing before an audience of more than 100 people, with his grandfather's prototype engine displayed beside him, Miguel spoke not just about mechanics, but about legacy, about how knowledge flows through generations, about the importance of honoring the past while building the future. "My grandfather never saw this engine run," Miguel said, his hand resting on the prototype. "But every bolt, every calculation, every innovation carries his spirit. And when Mr. Castellanos gave me the tools and knowledge to complete this project, he wasn't just helping me. He was helping my grandfather complete his work even after death." He paused, letting the words settle. That's what education really is. It's not just about learning skills. It's about connecting past with present, experience with potential, what was with what could be. This technical center is that multiplied. Dozens of people learning, teaching, preserving knowledge while creating new possibilities. The applause that followed was thunderous and sincere. Even veteran professionals in the audience stood up, recognizing they had witnessed something special. A boy who had grown not just in skill but in wisdom, articulating truths many adults struggled to express. After the formal event, when the crowd began to disperse, Eduardo and Miguel sat once more on the bench outside the workshop, exactly where they had had so many important conversations. The sun descended, painting the sky with the same shades of orange and purple they had witnessed 2 years ago. "There's something I need to tell you," Eduardo began. "My work in Barcelona is important, and I'm contributing to projects that could change the automotive industry. But the truth is that the most significant thing I've done in my career didn't happen in a corporate office or high-tech laboratory. It happened here, in a dusty town, working with a boy who taught me that true value isn't in titles or salaries, but in the connections we form and the lives we touch. You changed my life, Miguel responded simply. But I think I also understand now that I helped change yours, and that wasn't charity or rescue. It was exchange, equal, fair, mutual. Eduardo nodded, tears flowing freely down his face. Exactly. And that exchange continues. I have news. The patent application for the engine was approved. There are already 2 manufacturers interested in licensing the design. This means your grandfather's legacy will reach audiences he never could have imagined. And the income, as I promised, will be distributed among your family, the center, and additional development. Miguel absorbed this information with a calm that contradicted the magnitude of the news. 2 years ago, such an announcement would have overwhelmed him. Now he received it as simply the natural result of sustained hard work and dedication. There's something more, Eduardo continued. I want to establish an exchange program. Students from here can spend time in Barcelona workshops, exposed to cutting-edge techniques and technologies, and students from Europe can come here, learn the traditional methods that are so valuable, a bidirectional flow of knowledge. Like you and me, Miguel observed, 2 different worlds exchanging what each has to offer. Exactly. They sat in shared silence as night descended. Around them, the community followed its ordinary rhythm, children playing in the street, women hanging clothes, the distant sound of a radio mixing with cricket song. It was a scene that had reproduced for generations, and would probably continue for generations more. But something had fundamentally changed. In this community, at least, there was now a space where potential could flourish, where talent could develop independently of economic circumstances, where knowledge flowed freely between those willing to teach and those eager to learn. You know what's the funniest thing? Miguel suddenly said. All this started because you thought I couldn't fix your motorcycle. You laughed at me. Eduardo laughed, the sound warm and genuine. It was the silliest and luckiest laugh of my life. It taught me never to underestimate people based on appearances, to keep my mind open to unexpected possibilities. And I learned that sometimes the smallest hands hold the greatest destinies, Miguel responded, paraphrasing the words Eduardo had spoken 2 years ago. That poverty of circumstances doesn't equal poverty of capacity. That when people truly see each other, beyond labels and assumptions, they can create something extraordinary. When they finally stood to join the community dinner Rosa had organized, Eduardo paused a moment, looking at the illuminated workshop, listening to the sounds of work and learning emanating from within. Do you remember what I said that first day? He asked. That a broken thing needed to be fixed. I remember, Miguel responded. It turns out it wasn't the motorcycle that most needed repair. It was us. You needed opportunity, purpose, belief in your own worth. I needed to remember that life continues after loss, that new connections don't diminish old ones, but honor them in different ways, and together, piece by piece, day by day, we fixed each other. Miguel smiled, taking Eduardo's hand as they walked toward the illuminated house where family and community waited. That's what mechanics do, he said. We fix broken things, sometimes engines, sometimes lives, sometimes both. And the most beautiful thing is that when you fix something with care and love, it comes out stronger than before. The sound of laughter and music flowed from the house, a joyful contrast to the workshop's quietness behind them. The prototype engine rested on its stand, silent now but full of potential, a bridge between past and future, between a visionary grandfather and a determined grandson, between tradition and innovation. 2 years ago, a broken machine had brought together 2 strangers. Now a transformed community celebrated them, not as savior and saved, but as partners in an ongoing journey of discovery, growth, and shared hope. And on a dusty road at the edge of town, where it all began, the setting sun illuminated the path stretching toward the horizon, promising that this story, like Grandfather Gerardo's engine, would continue running, evolving, inspiring generations yet unborn, who would learn that the smallest hands, when given opportunity and belief, can truly hold the greatest destiny.